Those of us who handle complaints, advise other people on how to do it, and train complaint handlers are constantly asked, how do you handle impossible complainants? It's an important question, and it's one that we really ought to take more seriously than we do. It depends a great deal on why the customer is impossible or how, and to some degree the stage in the process in which their impossibleness reveals itself. But let's start off by understanding what makes a customer impossible. If you're a complainant, you're probably angry, you're probably upset, and angry, distressed people do not necessarily make pleasant company. Anger is an unpleasant emotion to handle, and it can make the most perfectly reasonable person quite impossible. It certainly makes me that way. I'm not a particularly nice complainant, and I know it. There are also people who just don't know how to communicate, particularly in confrontational situations with which they're not familiar. They sort of don't speak the language, if you like. And I don't mean that in terms of English or French or Polish. Linguistic capability has very little to do with it. Maybe they've just never been taught how to express themselves in a situation where they're angry or cross with the person that they're talking to, or at least the organization that that person represents. Beyond that, you get people who are ill, and this could just be a matter of physical illness, making it difficult for the customer to express themselves clearly, or it could be psychiatric or psychological or behavioral, whatever the right word is, I'm not sure. But you do get customers who are disabled in various different ways from communicating effectively. And it almost doesn't really matter what the cause is. There are also, though, some very unpleasant people out there, and they're made more unpleasant by the complaining environment, that aggressive, hostile environment in which customers express themselves when complaining. You know, we've all run into people who are just rude. In the complaint handling world, we know of stories of customers who were racist, obscene, homophobic, sexist, or just bullies, just nasty people. And then there are people who think, for various reasons, that it's appropriate to be like a lawyer, sort of litigious and aggressive. And that doesn't make them pleasant people to deal with, particularly if they convince themselves that the more awkward they make their communications, the better their result will be. Often these are simply law firms, some of whom are the most impossible complainants to deal with, because they feel that the correct approach is the sort of thing that works very nicely in the middle of the High Court in London or anywhere else, when it really isn't the right approach for customer complaints. From the firm point of view, there are a variety of different emotions and requirements. Rule 1 is that the firm has a legal obligation to provide a safe environment for staff to work in. Never forget that ultimately you need to keep your staff, and they're entitled to a degree of protection from some of the more unpleasant complainants out there. Having said that, the firm also wants to use the situation to discover something useful for the complaint investigation, typically. And anyway, it's not really about the complainant in some ways. It's about the firm showing what a good complaint handling team it has. How, as a company in general, it communicates in a proper, appropriate fashion when dealing with its customers, particularly when they're in distress or upset or angry. This is a particular opportunity, if you like, for the company to excel. Same is true, by the way, for ombudsman schemes. I've worked in a couple. You always want to show that you can handle the big one, the difficult complaint, and do it in a proper way. Having said that, the impossible complainant shows up in different situations and needs different handling depending on what you're talking about. The classic one, of course, is making the complaint, or dealing with inquiries from the firm who want to find out more about the complaint. There, the customer can be aggressive and unpleasant in all kinds of difficult ways. Then you have the law firm threatening litigation. That requires a completely separate type of handling. The next stop is one of the awkward ones. This is where the impossible complainant rings up or writes to say, where is the final response? And does so not necessarily politely. And the danger here is that you get pushed as a complaint handler into doing the wrong thing. And then finally, we have what we call the post-final response complaint problem. That's the customer that gets your reply and doesn't like it and now won't let go. And we'll talk about each of these different stages as they come along. Ultimately, though, the company or the organization is judged by how it handles the situation. It handles it well, it gets an enormous amount of credit, not just from the stakeholders in that organization, but sometimes from the complainant, who appreciates the excellence of the response received or the reaction. I remember once running a training course, we had some videotape. Actually, I just had the transcript of it, of the handling of various telephone calls. The best handled call of all was by a young man who introduced himself. He was about, I would guess, about 23, had tattoos, piercings in a variety of interesting places. He didn't seem to be the sort of person that would be great at handling a very, very depressed, very upset complainant. He was absolutely brilliant. First of all, he listened. Second of all, he showed that he was tuned in, made appropriate little interventions by saying, I hear, yep, thank you, that's very helpful. He took a deep breath, he didn't interrupt, and then he actually solved the problem. And when I said to the people in the room, well, what was so good about the way John, or whatever his name was, had handled the complaint? Everybody said he identified the issue correctly and responded to it. And said, no, he listened to this woman. I think he was the only person who'd listened to her in several weeks. And that was a very, very big deal for her. He was able then to resolve the problem, certainly, but that was part of the listening process. So, how do we deal with the impossible complainant apart from just listening? And I would say listening positively. I don't think you just say nothing and sit tight on the phone line, because otherwise there's a risk the customer thinks you're just not listening. Well, there are a variety of techniques. The most important of them is to remember that the complainant who's impossible is not necessarily somebody with an impossible complaint. In other words, people who are vulnerable and who therefore may not be particularly good at expressing themselves are, if anything, more likely than not to have been taken advantage of. They're the people you really need to tune into. When I was working in the Insurance Ombudsman Bureau in the early 90s, I took a phone call at about 5:15 in the afternoon. The woman started off by accusing the organization I worked for of bias, of being in the industry's hands, and a variety of other things. And I sort of made all the standard replies about, happy to send her a copy of the annual report and things like that. Didn't really do much good. And then she launched into a very, very long rant, during the course of which she's gently dropped the fact that she suffered from bipolar. Well, I've got family members who've suffered from that. I know a bit about it in a fairly amateur sort of way. So I thought, okay, tune her in, listen. Gradually, as her rant continued, she revealed the real story of what happened. And it tallied with what I had on file. Now, she didn't know when she rang up that I'd already written to the company expressing concerns about some of the things that their firm had employees had done. But nevertheless, she suddenly gave the complaint a whole new color. She explained that actually her boyfriend had conspired effectively with the advisor to get a loan from the company by using her policies as security for the loan. She added helpfully, actually, that she'd had a good moment that week and managed to stop this happening. Well, this was all very good information that any investigator would want to know. I wrote a letter to the company shortly afterwards, told the story, and suggested that they would need a statement from the advisor to contradict the story, or they might like to increase the distress and inconvenience payment quite considerably to a figure I gave them. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they wrote back and said, please present the offer to Mrs. So-and-so. She accepted. That was the end of the case. She was genuinely helpful. She may not have presented that way, but who cares? I didn't need protecting from her call. Maybe I'm brassy enough to handle that sort of thing. I was certainly, I think, grown up enough to realize that an active listening approach was fine. It would get me what I wanted. You know, we all have had this experience with people who are angry, that we let them blow themselves out, it's said. If you just let people talk, this does to some degree exhaust the anger. It sort of pours out and wastes itself on your telephone receiver. And then you have some better picture, much better picture of what really happened. You're ready to investigate the complaint properly because you know what the customer is really upset about. So you can do it that way, but that won't do for a more vulnerable member of staff. These people do need to have a handoff position. That is to say, a manager to whom they can pass the call if it's too much for them, if it's too distressing. They have to be able to say, look, can you just stop a second? Can I just pass you on to Jennifer, who I think would be better suited to handle this call? Otherwise, you have staff that don't turn up for work the following day, and that's not a good idea either. Now, there is a fine line between people who communicate in what I would describe as an unorthodox way, perhaps with a few swear words in and a bit of effing and blinding, as you might say, and people who cross the line. It's a very difficult line to spot, actually, partly because some people's view of a bit of banter is another person's view of something that's deeply offensive. Nevertheless, the complaint handler faced with a customer behaving in a borderline unacceptable way needs to keep a proper record. These days, firms should be keeping tape recordings anyway of these conversations. And at a certain point, if it gets a bit too much, it's time to stop and say, look, I'm terribly sorry, but we need to have this conversation in a different way. I'm not able to handle these references. You do get, as I said, some downright unpleasant people complaining, and their unpleasantness is exacerbated by the angry, hostile environment. The Insurance Ombudsman Bureau had an experience of sending a member of staff to go and see a complainant to investigate a very sensitive, high-value complaint, or at least potentially so. She was of an ethnic minority, and the couple concerned would not let her into their home because of this. She left politely. The ombudsman scheme rejected the complaint on the basis they were unable to investigate it properly. Look, we acted with dignity, I think, and I know the person concerned. I'm sure she would not have been aggressive or unpleasant back, but there are people in this world who frankly don't deserve the time of day. And as an employer, I think you have a duty to make this clear to people who abuse your staff. Again, a handover procedure to another manager. to somebody else who can explain that this is not the language you use. The law firm that threatens litigation is in a different place. These are people with the power, quite frankly, to issue the claim form, and you know it. If you get what is called a protocol letter, it's not a pleasant experience, and if you don't reply quickly, you will walk into a piece of litigation. And court cases, in whatever form they take, are always expensive, always unpleasant to handle. The art is not to let them happen. Easier said than done sometimes. Well, there are some techniques. I did a job for a company who shall remain nameless, who were a little bit prone to being sued. And I looked at the problem and thought, this is not safe and it's not very sensible. And I asked who the good local law firm was, and I found somebody who was absolutely brilliant. And we together worked out the solution. And it goes like this. First of all, just because someone's threatened to sue you does not take the case outside any of the known complaint rules. The Financial Ombudsman Service may decline jurisdiction if a court case has officially begun, but that's quite different from the situation where you're being threatened with it. And anyway, the Ombudsman has a discretion to continue the case, which suggests very clearly that the complaint rules do apply. In any event, it's a good practice thing to do, to include your litigation threats within your complaint handling process. You investigate them as normal, but you tell the firm what risk they're running. And the risk is this. If they choose to bring a court case against you when you're subject to an ombudsman scheme, which is free of charge to all complainants and does not put the complainant at any risk on costs, they never have to pay the firm's costs, then at the end of any trial, you reserve the right to reveal the fact that you promised them access to the ombudsman scheme. Now, this won't work for very high value claims over the already quite high maximum award limit at the Financial Ombudsman Service. That is, unless you're prepared to waive your right in advance to not implement any recommendations from the Ombudsman over and above the maximum award limit. You can understand why. If you have a claim which is for significantly more than the maximum award limit, you're going to end up in a courtroom, and I can understand why. That's not a problem. But the correct response in many cases is, this is our final response. Go to the Ombudsman. It's free. And if you choose not to, you run a risk of us telling a judge that the firm chose deliberately to avoid an alternative dispute resolution mechanism set up to protect their client. There is, though, a catch, and that is, of course, that the law firm's costs will almost never be awarded by the Financial Ombudsman Service, and that you also point out to them. That might make them less enthusiastic to pursue the claim. So those technical responses to this type of impossible complainant are required. And it's quite wrong to take the case outside the complaints process. While we're investigating our complaint, there is another moment where the impossible complainant shows up. They may already have shown up, actually, earlier in the story by writing an unpleasant, overly aggressive letter, but okay, that's what complaint handlers have to deal with. I'm talking now about that key moment where you're fairly close to the end of the investigation and the customer, or quite often the customer's partner, representative or whatever, rings up or writes overly aggressively saying, where is the final response letter? Typically abusing you for your incompetence at not having already completed it. One of the golden rules of investigating complaints is don't assess the complaint, and certainly don't write a final response letter until you've finished the investigation properly. It's what John Mortimer in the Rumpole books used to call premature adjudication, something that Rumpole used to accuse a number of different judges of. It's the worst crime in complaint handling. It makes cases go pathological. Let me explain to you why. So you're on your way to finishing the investigation. You've got the version of events of two of the key main players. You're waiting for the third report to come in. You get a vile, unpleasant, aggressive communication. You now start writing the final response letter. You sort of smear over the fact or cover over the fact that you don't have that third version of events that you really do need. What happens next? Well, the customer was there when it all happened. The customer knows that you're missing that piece of information and you've sort of smeared over it, and immediately replies by pointing out that your letter is rubbish or worse. Now you've got a problem because you now need to wait for that third report to come in. This, by the way, is based on a true story. Fortunately, I wasn't the complaint handler, but I might as well have been. Anyway, the complaint handler got the third report in, now has to redo the final response letter, groveling apology for having got it wrong the first time, but now any pretense at independence that that case handler had at the start of the case is well and truly gone. She's already expressed her view on the complaint, so unless she completely does an about turn on it, her second final response letter will be treated with the contempt that the first one perhaps deserved and certainly received. That particular case then resulted in further correspondence, letter to the chief executive, variety of deep unpleasantness. But the message is very simple. Don't get pushed into writing a letter too quickly to respond to a complaint. That's not to say you shouldn't respond promptly or handle your investigation efficiently. It's just that you don't jump too fast before you've got all the information in properly. Otherwise, there's going to be a disaster. The final stage in which the impossible complainant shows up is after you've issued a final response letter. In my ombudsman days, that was after the ombudsman had issued a decision. The situations are pretty similar, actually. I reckon everybody is entitled to one letter after the final response or ombudsman decision, seeking clarification, perhaps if it's the company's final response, suggesting they may have missed something, and maybe the company has missed something, and that's very helpful. Gives the firm a little bit of a chance to correct some mistakes. I was recently helping someone with a complaint, and they clearly got it all wrong, and I did suggest that the complaint handler show his response and my letter to his senior manager. I don't think he actually did it, or if the manager did see it, that person wasn't a terribly good manager, because the fraud department unwittingly contradicted the final response letter about a day later. Not very clever. But anyway, we're all entitled to one go, I believe. And as long as it's done pleasantly and politely, I can't see a particular problem to a second letter going out, which explains precisely why the decision was reached in the way it was. And if a mistake's been made, thank you very much. Here's another go at it. It becomes a bit different once that first letter's gone out. You get an angry response back straight away. I've had it happen to me when handling an ombudsman case. I made a terrible mistake because in those days we were handling faxes. I got a fax in, I sent a fax back. He sent a fax back. And then I realized the mistake. I was fueling the fire. The case was over anyway. I couldn't change the result, and I didn't want to either. I waited. Actually, I didn't. I wrote the reply, but I saved it on my PC and made a diary note to send the letter in 2 weeks' time. I then wandered into the post room in those days. Those of you who worked in the Insurance Ombudsman Bureau and PIA Ombudsman Bureau will remember Shirl in the post room. I gave Shirl the letter and I said, do me a favor, could you please send this second class? I never heard again from my correspondent. I think I slowed the process down, and that's frankly what you do. If you think about it, you've issued your final response, you've listened to any criticisms of it, you've completed the process required by the complaint rules of a thorough investigation, a final response, and now it's up to the Ombudsman. You have no further duties, at least until you're asked by the Ombudsman to cooperate with their investigation, but that's really a different problem. You don't have any duty to keep replying to the customer. Now, obviously, firms want to show themselves in the best possible light, and I don't want you to tell you to be rude to the customer or anything like that. But there does come a point where you have to put a stop to things. A polite letter that goes something like, Dear Mrs. Smith, thank you for your letter of X. We issued a final response letter on this date. That means you have 6 months from that date to go refer your complaint to the Ombudsman. But I'm afraid we're unable to enter into any further correspondence with you now. Yours sincerely, X. You can send that letter out as many times as it takes. But as I say, I would space the letters every 2 weeks. Always remind your correspondent about the 6-month limit. You don't want there to be any argument that in the middle of your discussion with the customer, you somehow waived the right to go to the Ombudsman, or rather waived your right to object to the customer going to the Ombudsman within the 6-month period. Don't make that mistake. You get customers who ring up. And again, a pleasant, polite phone call immediately after a final response letter, querying something or asking about something, that seems about right. Many firms put on their final response letters, if you have any queries, ring me, and often give the complaint handler's direct line, and that's good. Abusive calls are unacceptable. Persistent ones are also unacceptable. So at a given moment in time, the person taking the call has to say, look, I'm terribly sorry, but we can't have these conversations anymore about this case. It's all over. You can go to the Ombudsman. You've got your 6 months from the date of the final response letter to do so. I can't take any more calls from you, I'm afraid. And you can confirm that in writing. It makes good sense. The customer continues to call in. The person who takes the call passes the call to the manager. Actually, you know, that person doesn't really need to be the manager in a sense. Perhaps they're not available. They're not in the office that day. Another colleague will do the job. Look, I told Caroline that she was not to take any further calls from you in the light of the fact that we issued a final response on this date, gave you the right to go to the Ombudsman. You've got the 6 months from that date to do so. We really can't have any further calls from you. And my instructions to Caroline are that if you do ring her, that she's to pass the call immediately to me. That handoff does seem to work, particularly perhaps if it's confirmed in writing. But always remember, as a firm, you have your primary obligation to your staff. They must never be put in an unpleasant situation. And if they receive obscenities or inappropriate remarks that are personal or something like that, you have to protect them by providing a referral point, which may just go directly to the point, look, we can't handle that sort of comment. By the way, if you do get an obscene comment or a racist comment or something like that, perhaps they're the same thing, in fact they probably are, Always take a note of it. And if the case actually goes to the Ombudsman, it should be in the file. But this conversation did occur, and that inappropriate language was used, and offering a transcript of the telephone call makes perfect sense in the circumstances. I can't see any reason why a customer can claim compensation for distress and inconvenience, having frankly dished out the same thing to the firm. So now you've seen the full panoply of the impossible complainant. I'm sure there are other situations you can tell me about that we can add to future talks on this subject. I hope you found this interesting and that you can show to your colleagues and make them realize that they're not alone when they handle impossible customers. We've all done it. Some of us are better at it than others, and some of us almost enjoy it more than others, or at least are less distressed by it. But always remember, the complaint environment is a hostile environment. And when people are distressed, they don't always communicate in the way that you would like them to. And with that, please handle complaints safely and be safe. Thank you.